Good afternoon, friends. Today I'm going to tell you about the movie Tusk. Wallace, a mustachioed young American, and his friend Teddy host a podcast where they tell funny stories. They tell dirty, sometimes on the edge of propriety jokes. They blog where they post videos that they think are unusual and funny. Wallace tells Teddy about another video one of their subscribers found on an old laptop. The video shows a guy practicing with a samurai sword and accidentally cutting off his own leg. Of course, such a video interested our hero. It didn't take him long to contact the guy and arrange an interview. The homegrown samurai lives in Canada. Wallace travels to another country, spending $500 on a ticket. His girlfriend Allison tries to go with him, but Wallace is not the type to take extra baggage on a business trip. Teddy also stays in Los Angeles because he is afraid of flying. When Wallace flies to the Great White North and visits the hero of the video, he learns that he has died. He goes to his funeral. Upset by the ruined interview, Wallace goes to a local bar to have a drink, call Teddy, and complain about the injustice. After a couple of beers, he feels like going to the bathroom. There he discovers a strange thing on a board covered with the same sheets of paper. The old man offers to spend the night in his house for free. All the owner of the luxurious house wants is to tell incredible stories from his life. But that's exactly what Wallace wanted. He went to Canada for an incredible story for his podcast, and he gets it. Wallace calls the man and makes an appointment. On the way, he buys a drink from a local store, pouring it into an unnecessarily large plastic cup. He asks the salesgirl for directions to the address the landlord gave him. Once in the middle of nowhere, Wallace sees an old mansion in which old man Howard Hall lives. The owner greets him, sitting in a wheelchair, and offers him refreshing tea. Wallace enjoys drinking a cup or two. He listens to Mr. Hall's stories about his encounter with Hemingway and makes unfortunate jokes about the house and Howard. But Mr. Hall is hard to embarrass. He goes on and on about his life of hardship and tragedy. When he was very young, his parents were murdered in front of him. Howard ended up in an orphanage and from there in a mental institution. But that's not what Mr. Hall wants to tell Wallace. He's busy with another story. Hall prefers to tell about the day he first experienced real terror. Howard Hall recounts how he worked as a cook on the ship Anastasia, which was wrecked in the northern seas near Kamchatka. Howard is the only one who managed to survive in the icy waters. He swam for a long time, holding on to a lifeline, until he was finally rescued by a walrus. Once on the island where this huge animal lives, Howard was sure he would die of cold, thirst and hunger, but the walrus encouraged and fed him. Mr. Hall does not have time to finish the incredibly fascinating story. Wallace begins to feel sick, weak, his head becomes heavy, and his eyesight begins to fail. Finally, Wallace realizes that it is all because of the tea. He tries to ask the master of the house, but cannot and faints. While Wallace was unconscious, it turns out he's not such a bad guy. He loves Allison, who has been with him since Wallace was a loser unable to provide for himself. That's the kind of loser Wallace doesn't like. Perhaps that is why he becomes cynical and unprincipled. Allison tells her boyfriend that she misses the way he was. After all, he used to cry over Winnie the Pooh, and as her grandfather used to say, a man should have a soul. Wallace wakes up sitting in a wheelchair, his legs covered with plaid. Mr. Hall is also here. He tells his guest that yesterday he was bitten by a poisonous spider. Wallace faints and Hall is forced to call a doctor. The doctor discovers that Wallace's leg is in terrible condition. It is swollen, and the doctor had to amputate it to prevent infection. This news, like the sight of his leg cut off at the knee, horrifies Wallace. He does not believe the old man's story and demands to use his phone to call his family. But Mr. Hall refuses. He refers to the doctor, who has removed all telephones from the house to ensure the patient's peace of mind. Over dinner, Wallace learns that Howard Hall can walk and that the wheelchair is a hoax to create the image of the helpless old man. Wallace accidentally finds his cell phone by the sound of a phone ringing. It's Allison calling him because he hasn't been heard from in 3 days. Wallace doesn't have time to pick up the phone. He calls Allison back, but she doesn't pick up either. Wallace leaves Allison a message, then calls Teddy, but he doesn't pick up. In the morning, Allison and Teddy discover 2 messages on their voicemail from a friend telling them that some madman has kidnapped him, cut off his leg, and is holding him in the middle of nowhere in Canada. For Wallace, his attempt to contact the outside world ends sadly. Mr. Hall hits the boy over the head with a walrus bone, and Wallace loses consciousness again. When Wallace wakes up, he finds that he has lost his other leg and that his arms from his shoulders to his elbows are sewn to his sides. His mouth is missing several teeth, as well as his tongue. Now he can only moo like an animal. Mr. Hall says walruses can't talk, so he removed Wallace's tongue. He tells the boy that he wants to recreate his savior, the same walrus he called Tusk. He wants to recreate him so he can have a second chance at life. In the basement of the mansion there is a pool with a playground, reminiscent of that abandoned walrus island where Mr. Hall ended up. The old man teaches the newly minted Tusk how to swim and prepares him for life as a walrus. In the process of training, Wallace sees dozens of other unfortunates' corpses killed by a crazed maniac. Meanwhile, Wallace's girlfriend and his friend Teddy are looking for him in Canada. The American police have not helped them, so they go to the local police department. They fear that Wallace is already dead. The cops don't really believe the kidnapping story, given Wallace's cheerful disposition and penchant for jokes. They assume it's another prank, but still put the American on the missing persons list. They give Allison and Teddy the phone number of a detective who may know something about a possible kidnapper. The meeting with the detective did not bring relief to the friends. The detective was looking for this maniac. He had lost sleep and his appetite. He had lost his job and his wife. He was thought to be crazy, but the detective doesn't give up. He says he's already found bodies of people without lower limbs with their arms sewn into their bodies. When Teddy and Allison are about to give up on the crazy detective's help, he tells them that he once saw a maniac, but under a different name and in a different place. Together with the detective, the friends go in search of Wallace. After learning that he likes to buy drinks in large plastic cups, they arrive at the store where Wallace was asking for directions. The saleswomen recall a funny American with a mustache. They give the detective a notebook in which Wallace has written down Mr. Hall's address. On the way, they find Wallace's car half immersed in the pond, but Wallace himself is not in it. The detective convinces his friends that he knows where the guy is. He hands out guns, and the whole company goes to the maniac's house. They still don't know what's going on in the basement with the pool, and it's better for them not to see it. Mr. Hall realizes that the hour of battle has come. He tells Wallace how the walrus he saved fed him, keeping him from starving to death. Howard had to kill the Tusk and eat its meat just before the rescue ship appeared on the horizon. Since that day, Howard has regretted his action. He considers the killed walrus the supreme creature on the planet, and humans as pathetic and unworthy of life. Mr. Hall was dressed in a walrus costume made of scraps of leather. Tusks were attached to his head. A battle ensued, full of incoherent screams and the sound of blows. All other versions of the Tusks died from Mr. Hall's blows, which means that the dead walrus never got back at his killer. By Howard's design, the fight was supposed to be a fair, even fight. He had no idea that at this moment Teddy and Allison were running around his mansion in a panic looking for a friend. The detective is also out there somewhere, armed with a shotgun. The struggle between the walrus and the man in the walrus costume was fierce but short-lived. The moment Allison and Teddy find Wallace in the basement, he kills the old man by tearing his body apart with his tusks. The sight of this horrifies everyone. Wallace stares intently at his friends. There is nothing human in his gaze, only rage and pain. He mooses, unable to utter a word. The detective smoothly points his gun, preparing to shoot. There is a scream. A year has passed since that day. Allison and Teddy arrive at the city zoo. They get out of the car and walk to the entrance. In Allison's hand is an oblong paper bundle. They walk, as if in a funeral procession, to the enclosure with the lone walrus. But there is no one in or near the pool. The walrus is hiding in its cave and won't come out. Allison unwraps the bundle, pulls out a fish and tosses it on the concrete pad in front of the cave. She calls Wallace's name and tries to talk to him. The walrus appears and gratefully eats the fish. Then he looks at his old friends, but they see nothing human on his face. Allison cries, remembering the story of her grandfather, who said that tears distinguish humans from animals. She says she loves Wallace. Teddy takes the girl away. At that moment, a few tears come out of the walrus eyes. Thanks for watching. Sign up and like it if you want more of these reviews.